My name is Saidi Herrera. I'm the Multicultural Officer for the Oklahoma Historical Society, and I'm glad to be here to also address the topic of how OSU responded after the 9/11 event. And I'm really looking forward to learning everything that happened through OSU. And so I will go ahead and introduce the panelists for today. We have with us Sarah Griswold. She's the Assistant Professor of History. And then Jin Kim. She's the Assistant Professor, Religious Studies Program, and the Department of Philosophy. We also have Corinne Schwarz. She's the Assistant Professor, also with Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies Program, and the Department of Sociology, and Daniel Sexton, which is a research assistant. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for staying and paying attention to this presentation. So please go ahead and let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you. We elected not to sit there, so sorry that you didn't when we introduced ourselves, or when we were just introduced. You probably can only see the back of our heads, but we're going to be hopping up and down quite a bit to share the slides, and so you'll get a little more face time with each of us. So I'm Dr. Sarah Griswold. I am a history professor at OSU. Adjuncted a bit at OU, so I can slip up sometimes. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. I also want to take a moment just to acknowledge the fact that you didn't really have a choice in terms of panels about which one to attend. And so I would just simply like to acknowledge the fact that Chandra Powell from the National Park Service was unable to join us because of funding and travel restrictions that have affected the National Park Service. I'm sure that many of us in the room, myself included, if I wasn't on this panel, would have wanted to hear about the Reconstruction Era National Historic Network and how it connects to the history of Oklahoma. I know that network includes sites of Reconstruction history in places from Beaufort, South Carolina, to Alabama, to what I have to assume are either plans underway or plans that are just being hatched about bringing a site to fruition in Oklahoma. And so I can speak on behalf of our panel that I'm really disappointed for Chandra and disappointed for the people who are attending this conference. But we're happy to share our work with you. And so I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague, Jin Kim. So I can do it for you.
Hello, thank you. I'm Jin. I'm in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. So I will cover our project origins in a brief overview. And the order of our presentation today. So we're going to talk about the Akali's discourse. Corinne, my colleague, she's going to talk more about what Akali is. And we're going to talk about some campus interfaith work that we observed after 9/11. And then finally, we're going to talk about students working for academic freedom. So the first thing is, I wanted to give you a little bit of overview how this project came along. So we, all three of us, and together with Danielle as our research assistant, we were selected as the fellows of OSU's Center for the Humanities Research. And they were looking for fellows who could engage in inter- or transdisciplinary research project. And all of us showed interest in this theme of peace, justice, and nonviolence. And then we were grouped into one group. So at the beginning, we started like checking on each other. Who are you? And what kind of study you do? And how did you envision this project as you were applying for this fellowship? And of course, because we have different scholarly background and different understandings of these themes, we just spent a couple of months talking about our own background and understanding. And that led us to think about the teaching event on OSU student activism. So after going through our readings that we selected, we thought that it would be really useful to talk about some student activism at OSU. So we talked about teach-in or conference or any kind of event. But as we were planning for that, we decided that it's better for us to narrow it down a little bit. And especially because all three of us were really interested in kind of like learning what happened in the past as a way of important asset for us to move on and what kind of needs that we can fulfill on our campus in Oklahoma. So we pivoted on March 2024, we pivoted to archival searches. And that one led us to focus on the search for a colleague. So as of right now, the question that we are having in our research is, what does campus activism look like in the wake of 9/11? And that naturally leads us to compare what was going on in OSU in the past and then also what is going on at the moment. Yes, I'm gonna give my mic to Corinne.
All right, hello. So, my name is Corinne Schwarz. I'm an assistant professor in gender, women's, and sexuality studies, and my tenure home is sociology at Oklahoma State University. So, this slide is presenting our initial findings from the April 2024 to the very start of the fall semester, fall 2024, our initial explorations of the OCOLLI, the Daily O-Collegian Student Newspaper Archive. So at Oklahoma State University, our student newspapers are digitized through, I want to say, 2008. So you can go back to the start of the OCOLLI existing at OSU. You can look at like the microfilm, but also all of the digitized records are available for access. So in our initial exploration of the OCOLLI with that very big, broad question, what does student activism look like in the wake of 9/11? These are some of the initial things we discovered. So what we got from a very, I don't want to say general, but it was like, what can we find in a non-systematized way? This is then what informs our more formal data collection moving forward. So mixed reactions, right? A lot of fear, confusion, anger, things we'll talk about later. And things we're happy to talk about more in the Q&A as well. Sometimes that anger is very directed, and sometimes that anger is very diffuse. A specific focus on understanding Islam and Muslim student experiences. A lot of interfaith activism, while it's involving a lot of religious and faith communities at OSU and in Stillwater, a lot of the articles that we found centered on or specifically addressed Islam, understanding Islam more, or Muslim students expressing their needs on campus. And that leads into interfaith activism. We did see a lot of faculty, students, staff, and community groups coming together in the wake of 9/11 to explore these issues and questions. Critiques against genocide and calls for a nonviolent approach, but then also with the mixed reactions. For articles that we found talking about students taking action to educate about the realities of war and violence, we were also finding articles where students were calling for more war and violence, right? So simultaneously, we're seeing a nonviolent presence, but also the presence of violence. One of the things that you'll see more as we go further in our presentation is, as with, and I say this with a lot of generosity and understanding for college students and undergraduate students in particular, in the ways that we make meaning of the world. Sometimes there might be moments of inconsistencies, cognitive dissonances, and things where we're perhaps saying one thing and our discourse or the narratives we're creating in a student newspaper are saying something else. And so the next two slides are going to show some examples of this initial non-systematized data approach that we used. So the first is from 9/13/2001, so this is 2 days after the September 11th attack. You'll see in a lot of our Okali screenshots, we're using a lot of op-eds. This was a very active source, an active place in the student newspaper for the years that we're analyzing. And the reason that we selected this article in our initial analysis, because it stood out, we must take action against terrorism, but the pull quote, and if you see it, it might be very small and difficult to see, but it's the pulled quote in the very middle. Someone, quote, someone called down the thunder and Thor himself will answer. So in talking about the realities of violence and war, people are calling upon legend and myth to make meaning of that. And that's something that we found particularly interesting in this initial scan. The second example that we have from the early stages of our archival analysis comes from a special edition of the Daily Oak Collegian from September 11th, 2002. So they had a special issue a year later. Everything in this issue is about September 11th. And this stood out to us, thing number one, because it's not an op-ed. It's an actual article, a news article from a student reporter about goings-on on campus, new system to check international students. And this article is describing the policies and practices that are implemented to monitor, surveil, and regulate international students' experiences on campus that did not exist prior to September 11th. So we're seeing different offices on campus getting different practices and services associated with them in direct response to 9/11 that did not exist before. So I'm now going to hand it back to Sarah to talk about how our project moved beyond that April 2024 initial, just seeing what we could find in the archives.
Okay, thank you. So I'm back. In about late spring 2024, so just before we let out for summer, we built a list of guiding questions. We wanted to be fairly pinpointed with our research going forward, and so we drilled it down to 5 key questions. In the aftermath, how did the OSU campus react? What was the Okali's discourse and coverage? What kinds of services, events, and or dialogues emerged on campus? How were students affected by national and campus policies? And that included, international students, as you just saw on the last slide, but also, students who were enrolled in ROTC. And so I do want to kind of signal out Daniel Sexton, who is one of our undergraduate research assistants who's at our table and who will come up during the Q&A, who was the one who pointed out to us that he was starting to see a lot more advertisements in the student newspaper for enlistment in the military, as well as, we've all found coverage of ROTC students, including students who died in the Iraq War. And then finally, what forms of student activism gave rise? So we put in motion a project plan, and I want to note that because the Center for the Humanities at OSU was sponsoring our research, it was really supportive and directional. We appreciated, being pushed to come up with project deliverables. And so you can see what we've come up with. There's some pieces that we're still developing. Next year in 2026 will be the 25th anniversary of 9/11, and so we're looking to, by that point, work with OSU libraries, as one example, to have a platform for the archive that we're building. And so that is, I want to single out 2 main deliverables. One is creating what we're calling the OSU After 9/11 archive. And right now, what we've been working on is building this archive of the student newspaper, all articles that relate to 9/11. And to do that, we hired OSU students to help us with our research, which to us was really important, not just to give students experience doing historical research, but many of our students were not born, until after 9/11, and so they bring a really exciting, refreshing perspective to the research process. So next slide. And so I do want to kind of give you a sense of how we've been working so far. Corinne mentioned that the student newspaper is digitized. we have had some, not everything's perfect, right, in research. And so it's so great that it's digitized. The search tool is not Google, right? And so we sometimes have found that we have to just read the entire paper in order to find articles that relate to our research questions. But this has been our stop number one, is the OCOLLI's digital platform on the OSU Library's website. I think next slide. And then this is what some of the pieces have looked like since for our process. We put out a call for research interns. You can see our flyer on the left. That went out in the fall. We had 2 students we ended up being able to hire. One couldn't make it today, who helped us with the research because we decided we are going to look at least 7 years of activity in the student newspaper, as far as we can get up to. So from 2001 to 2008, which is a voluminous amount of reporting. We needed student interns. And so we've started to build, right now it is a multi-tiered spreadsheet. So we've been assigned each sheets below. You can't really see them, it's too small, but each of us has taken a year. And that's how, so for example, Daniel is working on 2003, I'm working on 2004, and we've been coding into Excel all of the articles that we find. So next, I think you're up next. Okay.
And so I went back because I wanted to point out there's something, if you actually wouldn't mind going back. So if you'll see, we have a column that says tone or value. One of the things that we were really interested in seeing what stories people were telling and what narratives were presented in the student newspaper was if we were seeing stuff that was about war, about patriotism, about pacifism, about resistance. And one of the things that you'll see, and I'm attentive to this because this is my section that's the screenshot, there's a lot of neutral or the description vague beyond a general reference to supporting the United States or military, vague beyond a general reference to resistance. And that's where I want to take us in our conversation about the findings for the OCOLLI so far. Things are a little incoherent and inconsistent, and I think that's actually a really important finding. This is an inter and transdisciplinary project, and one of the things that we need to do moving forward as we look into building this archive and doing some kind of critical analysis, we're trying to dip our toe into higher education studies to figure out what research is out there about college students' political development. It is so clear in the OCOLLI, especially the op-eds, students are trying to work through something. They might not be sure what it is they're trying to work through or trying to make meaning of, but the student newspaper has become a vehicle and a vector for that. So the first thing that I want to show is a political cartoon. We're really fortunate that we're working with a time period where political cartoons were still relevant. Our current editions of the OCOLLI don't have a ton of political cartoons and, importantly, don't have a consistent op-ed presence. In the issues that we're looking at, students there's not just an op-ed writer, but they have their name, a title of their op-ed series, and a link to their personal email address. It's not their okstate.edu, it's their AOL or Hotmail account. I don't want to say like it's people building a brand, but it does feel like people building a particular voice, a particular platform, and it'll be interesting to see once we get further on if certain people are changing their perspectives or their approaches underneath a rubric. Like there's one person who I'm so fascinated by, and his account, or not his account, his op-ed series is called like, "Don't be a monkey, don't follow the leaders." Like he's trying so hard to be resistant, and it's like, what will that look like at the end of your time as an op-ed editor? What will that look like 2 months from when you start writing? So I'm very curious about that. On to the political cartoons. So this political cartoon is from January 16th, 2002. So we're at the start of the new semester. This is one of the first issues that comes out for the spring 2002 semester. And it's a political cartoon. We're also starting to notice the same signatures in political cartoons. Some of them are very clear and attached to a student name. This is one of the ones that's more difficult to read. It looks like gathering in between the two characters, but we haven't been able to match that to any student writing at the time. So we have someone who is sort of drawn to be, let's say, a prototypical male OSU student of the time with a backwards baseball cap, and then we have a figure that is a caricature that we saw in a lot of political cartoons in this era, someone vaguely drawn to be reflective of an unidentifiable Middle Eastern community. There's a lot of assumptions that we might be putting onto that person's identity about where they're from and beliefs that they have. And we see this political cartoon doing something. The student is thinking the sort of stigmatizing language that we saw about terrorism being put onto people at that time, but then we also see that figure that's constructed to be the figure of the terrorist thinking back at the student. And this was particularly interesting to us because it doesn't feel like the sentiment is anything beyond don't judge your neighbor, don't judge your peer, but that also kind of aligns with some of the messages that we're getting, that it's about we're seeing a lot, especially in the op-eds, about caring about your campus community and making sure your campus community feels comfortable without necessarily connecting that to different power structures or systematic dynamics that could be shaping how people feel comfortable on campus or not. The next is a quote from an op-ed by Cass Rains. So again, this was one of the first issues in 2002. The events of our time challenge all. And I selected this because it shows that in some ways not a lot has changed. When I read this, at least the first paragraph, I thought of a lot of the conversations that happened around COVID-19 and the pandemic and students' experiences on campus. So from Rains, quote, "Some may call it apathy, others may call it a lack of patriotism or maturity, but people not only needed a vacation away from classes, they needed a vacation away from life. The terrorist threat may not be the first thing on people's minds, but it isn't the last. For months now, there has been a small voice of worry whispering in everyone's ear to be wary and expect something to happen," end quote. And I'm not trying to conflate the experiences of being on campus after 9/11 with the experiences of being on campus during the COVID-19 pandemic. But this idea that students are aware that they're being constructed as apathetic, disconnected from the realities of the world, intentionally avoiding the news, students were aware of that then, they're aware of that now, and we're curious to see how the narratives in the OCALI might be working with and against those assumptions that students know others on campus might be holding about them. And I'm now going to pass it to Jin to talk about campus interfaith work.
Yeah, another thing that we wanted to discuss was the campus interfaith work that were ongoing that started off from 9/11. So the first thing that happened, I would like to say that there were three larger categories. And one was the interfaith movement organized and led by Muslim student associations. So because there were so many misunderstandings of what Islam or Muslims were, so the student group, they held lots of events like understanding Muslim women, or understanding the Ramadan, or correct understanding of Muslim. And they sometimes even corrected some of those ideas that were in a OCALI that were wrong about Islam. I think you can. And another thing that we find is that there was a very active movement by student interfaith organizations. So there's a group like Interfaith Dialogue Student Association at OSU, Interfaith Council of OSU, and they got connections with other larger interfaith groups in Oklahoma, like Institute of Interfaith Dialogue. And they organize in-campus conferences and guest speaker series, as well as some more like fun activities like celebrating the light. So you can see over here in the first article coming from 2003, December the 3rd, religious groups celebrate light. So that one was basically organized by Interfaith Dialogue Student Association and Interfaith Council of OSU. They brought together different students who were practicing different religions. And because in many religious traditions like Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, and even in Buddhism, light functions as a very important symbol that can be interpreted differently, but it is a symbol that we all can connect to. And in that shared ritual space, they were trying to broaden their understanding and connections with each other. Other than that, another event that I think we can go back a little bit over here. Yes. And group speaks about living as neighbors. So all those movements were really student-led. They were trying to make this campus a bit more harmonious and a place where we acknowledge more diversity in terms of religion and ethnicity. Another very fun project that got reported on a Kali was the student reporter. She disguised herself as a Muslim woman with hijab on her head, and then she just went to her normal classes. And she kind of observed over 5 days, over a week, she observed the responses of her her friends, classmates, and faculty members, or just general public on campus, and it's really fun. So like on the first day, she went to her normal class, and then another classmate who was sitting next to her, she just gazes into her hijab and then say, "This is the most awful attire before God." So she was like, and then after the class, she kind of like catches her and then asks her, how would you feel if someone talks to you like that about your clothing? And this gets fun. She's not like violently responding, but like that girl who responded really badly to her in the beginning, she said, "I would feel bad." And then the reporter goes on and explains, this is something that we treasure. And then that young girl, she kind of like, "Okay, I'm sorry." So it kind of like reports that the situation that probably on campus there was just like lack of understanding, but it also kind of, I thought that the article was showing some optimistic point of view that, once we try, we can connect to each other and broaden our understandings of each other. Another day, her ex-boyfriend passes her by twice, even though he recognizes her, but he passes her twice. It could be because it's just ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend you don't want to recognize, but, she was wearing hijab. On the third day, she encounters a bit more hatred when a Christian student, she says that, "I pray for you that you will be saved when you go to hell." And she responds like, "I do understand God and hell different way." And then that also opens up a small dialogue. But all these things, this report is very fascinating because it kind of shows where OSU students' atmosphere was like at the wake of 9/11. And the students were really actively trying to figure out. That's that one. Yeah, I think this is it for me.
So I have the last finding so far that we're going to profile, and I should say that we have found many findings. We just chose to focus on 3 today. So we could, during Q&A, if you wanted to talk to us about kind of security changes at OSU, we've clearly found some articles in the paper about that. But what I'm going to talk about is some student activism that developed on campus in the wake of 9/11. So because I had 2004, this is why I came across this. I began to see the mention in the newspaper of a new group on campus called Students for Academic Freedom. And so, for example, on January 30th, 2004, there was an advertisement in the Okali. "Is your professor using the classroom as a political soapbox?" And this was sponsored by the Students for Academic Freedom, alleging in the advert that professors might be using the classroom to peddle anti-Bush, anti-Iraq war positions. About a week later, on February 6, 2004, on the front page of the Okali, there was an article, a feature article, "Students Educated on Academic Rights." And I'll just read you a quote from this article. Quote, "This is a problem nationwide. Teachers are openly expressing their ideas about controversial subjects such as politics and the situation in the Middle East." And the article goes on to quote one Barrett Shipp, who, after a little bit of sleuthing, I figured out was the founder and the president of Students for Academic Freedom at OSU. And so there's multiple ways that we think our research matters. And we do have directions for going forward that I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, but I want to expand a bit on the Students for Academic Freedom and point out that this was not a unique organization organized at Oklahoma State. It had been created in 2003 by David Horowitz, who actually died earlier this week at age 86. He was a neoconservative who'd helped chapters of Students for Academic Freedom pop up across the United States. Clearly, by 2004, within about 6 months, the OSU chapter had developed. One of these Students for Academic Freedom chapters was at Duke University, founded by a young man named Stephen J. Miller, who became Horowitz's protege, who had actually been Horowitz's protege, who we now know has a different role. I'm sure we all know Stephen Miller is one of the lead advisors to President Trump. Horowitz had been upset by academics' response to 9/11, chiefly the concerns raised by academics about the mass targeting of Arab and Muslim Americans, the war in Iraq, and the infringement of civil liberties in the name of Homeland Security. And so this is the kind of broader context that we have for the creation of Students for Academic Freedom nationwide, but also at OSU. And so when we look at some of the longer legacies of 9/11, and some of the shorter term legacies of 9/11, one thing that we're looking at is the creation of political activism on campus in its many kind of permutations. One of them being Students for Academic Freedom, which we are starting to look at more longitudinally as one of the examples of a kind of growing movement over the last 25 years to curb political, or curb what is alleged to be the politicization of the American university. So with that, I'm going to invite my co-panelists, including Daniel Sexton, who I do want to encourage any questions, for Daniel, who is an undergraduate researcher on our group. If you're interested in knowing about our methodology or our process, any of us can answer those questions.
Hello, my name is Dr. Steve Davis, and I was the principal at the middle school in Stillwater when this occurred. So a lot of people don't realize that Stillwater at that time, we had like 17 countries and dialects that were reflected inside of my middle school. Okay, so we had the whole school. Now we were kind of compartmentalized because in elementary school, most of them went to Westwood Elementary, so they were all there, and then they came to the middle school from the whole city. My experience that day was a lot of concerned parents from both sides. A lot of Muslim people saying, we got to get our kids out of the school, home. And we had a lot of white people saying, we got to get our kids out of the school and home. Rumors were the F-18 had landed in Cushing because it's a target, and we went through a whole lot of stuff. I was telling parents, you send your kid to my school, I will protect him. And so after the first day, we had most of the kids back because our school was safe. We had Guy Palladino was our school resource officer and did a great job protecting the kids. And so we set up things, but the only thing I remember is that on campus that afternoon, somebody was beat up, and I don't know whether it appeared in the old colleague or not, but we did have a report of a student being assaulted on campus, and of course that lit the fuse. And whether that was true or not, I couldn't sit here today and tell you whether that happened or not, but it was reported back through us. Hey, watch this, keep track. And so we did a lot, and the old colleague was, I think, really hamstrung because they couldn't go to press as fast enough, and they, even at that time, we were still getting lots of misinformation back in, but it was a very unique time. But I think right afterwards, I think the community became a lot more cohesive to not point fingers, not try to say it's your fault or because you're from this country, it's your fault. And, the fallout of that, the Stephen Millers who came later, wanted to do that. But it was an interesting time in Stillwater because of the community that we served. And even in the minority community, there were problems. They all, just because you're a minority doesn't mean you agree on everything. And that was going on in our community. There was lots of things, but the mosque was the center, and a lot of things went through that mosque that when we heard about it, I'm going, just don't do that, but it was interesting in your research. If you keep going through this, you'll find lots of, it's going to be interesting. Sir, where other than the old colleague did you look? Did you look at the news press and come up with anything from them?
Thank you so much. I will just say we have, our plan is to do oral histories, and we're going to come do an oral history with you if you'd be into that, because it sounds like you have really a lot of information, experiential information, and really relevant. So thank you very much for sharing your memories of that day. To answer your question, I will say your question is about if we looked at more than the Okali. The answer is not yet. Right now we're trying to build a pretty exhaustive study because we're really interested in student newspaper reporting. I will say that, we absolutely realize the limitations of that. And so, for example, the student getting beaten up, that is not in the Okali, as you mentioned, probably because it's hamstrung. I don't know if they were discouraged from, printing that. I don't know. We do want to at some point try to get our hands on the university's own records, which is going to be a longer process.
I know we have one other question. As you go over there, I do just want to quickly add, one of the things that brought us to this project was our interest in student activism, because as assistant professors at OSU, all of us are pre-tenure right now, we were trying to understand, there are some histories of activism that we can access on the OSU campus. There are some active sociology department alumni who were part of civil rights work in the 60s and 70s who are still quite active on campus. But in our conversations with students, it felt like, not that there wasn't an activist history, but there was not one in recent memory that folks could pull upon to shape their current work. So if student organizing is happening on campus and the most active examples we have are from the 60s and 70s, how do we make meaning of that? How do our students make meaning of that? And so that's when we started thinking about what we could access in our memories, but perhaps our students couldn't because of when they were born, which always humbles me that I have so many students who weren't born then. But it was an interest in student activism at OSU in a more recently accessible memory that brought us to this. So I did want to share that context before we take our last question, probably.
I didn't want to ask another question because I've been talking so much, but I'd like to toss something out from the opposite perspective. When my wife and I hitchhiked around Europe in the early 80s, everybody was horrified by Reagan, but people of color and Muslims would always come up to us and talk about how much more they trusted Americans than anybody else. It was virtually universal. Then I received the first Fulbright teaching scholarship to Morocco after 9/11. It was the same thing. The people were saying how they respected the Muslims in Morocco would always make a point of it. A lot of them thought I was CIA, but they made a point that they trusted Americans so much more than they did Europeans. And it upsets me so much because you know that's not the way it is anymore.
Thank you. I think there was one more question over. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jen Holland. I'm a professor down at OU. I'm just wondering if there's anything like very Oklahoma or place-based specific in what you found, like either, I mean, in some ways you could see echoes from what people have said, like a connection to the Murrah building bombing, a sense of like distance closed between Oklahoma and New York, other kinds of like ways in which people are imagining themselves as distinctly Oklahoman, but something to bring to this conversation, or Oklahoma history that is brought to bear in the conversation.
I don't have much to say real quick on this, but I was smiling and looking at Sarah because this is one of the things we've been talking about. Like, what is uniquely Oklahoman about this? Especially because in our current time at OSU, we're America's friendliest campus, TM. This idea that there is, and a lot of the conversations that I've had anecdotally is that that's actually a post-Murrah building. That's a post-Oklahoma City, that incident where, but we have not seen that explicitly in what we've seen so far in the student narratives, and it could be another temporal moment, right? Who's writing, who remembers that bombing? So what I will say is we are looking for it. I really like that question because there is something about how OSU brands itself now that that has to come from something other than just trying to have a trademark. But I feel like, Daniel, you want to say something better than me, so please do.
Not better, but a little bit of a connection to your question is OSU, as mentioned previous, is a very large ROTC school, and if you look at records, the ROTC, like from World War I, World War II, we have a large amount of people who are immediately pulled out and sent over. And so my area of focus on this was actually the invasion of Iraq. And so the invasion of Iraq happens while the students are on spring break. And so a week before that, though, 4 students had already been sent over to Iraq. But pre-invasion or anything, the students return by the Friday of that same week. Almost 60 students from the ROTC program had been sent over to Iraq for the invasion. So I hate to tie it to being an Oklahoma thing, but with the prevalence of ROTC and like how many soldiers we have sent out from OSU alone over the years, that kind of makes it, that Oklahoma connection. But yeah, that is a great question to do a deeper dive into.
Well, I think everybody here remembers that morning, and regardless the place that we were in, we can remember where we were at that moment. And so this is a very important topic. Thank you so much for bringing light to this, and there are a lot of more conversations that will continue to come up after this. So give them a big round of applause. Thank you for your presentation.